The entire restaurant laughed at the waitress, until the billionaire's mother grabbed her hand and begged her not to leave. Elena Romano had almost reached table 4 when Chloe Belladonna slid her heel beneath the tablecloth. Elena tripped hard. Crystal exploded across the marble floor as ice water splashed directly onto Viviana Rossi's silk dress. Laughter spread instantly through the restaurant. "Some people really don't belong in places like this," Chloe said coldly while nearby guests smirked openly. Elena's face burned with humiliation, but before she could stand, Viviana's trembling fingers suddenly closed around Elena's wrist. Fear flashed across the older woman's face as she leaned forward and spoke in rapid Italian. "Cara mia, ti sei fatta male?" "My dear, are you hurt?" "Sto bene, signora." "I'm okay, ma'am." She knelt calmly beside Viviana and removed a folded white linen handkerchief from her apron pocket, the embroidered initials LB stitched neatly into the corner. "Mi dispiace tanto, signora," Elena whispered softly while dabbing the older woman's sleeve. "I'm so sorry, ma'am." Viviana's trembling fingers closed tightly around Elena's wrist. Fear flooded the older woman's face as her breathing turned uneven. Then she began speaking rapidly in Italian. Not formal Italian. Tuscan dialect. Old-fashioned. Regional. The kind almost nobody outside Florence still understood anymore. Chloe rolled her eyes immediately. Wonderful. She's rambling again. But Elena didn't move because unlike everyone else at that table, she understood every word. Viviana's terrified eyes darted briefly toward Chloe before locking desperately onto Elena again. "Mi vogliono portar via." They want to take me away. "Quella donna è veleno," that woman is poison. A chill ran through Elena instantly. Across the table, Adrian's attention finally sharpened. For the first time all evening, he was fully listening. Viviana tightened her grip harder as tears shimmered in her frightened eyes. "Per favor, please. Non lasciarmi sola con loro." Don't leave me alone with them. And the entire restaurant no longer felt loud. It felt dangerous. Elena Romano's blood ran cold as Viviana Rossi clutched her wrist like she was holding on to the last safe person in the room. Across the table, Billionaire CEO Adrian Rossi finally looked up from his phone, his dark eyes narrowing as he studied Elena with sudden interest. "You understand her?" he asked quietly. Elena hesitated. Chloe Belladonna's stare felt razor-sharp from across the table while Viviana tightened her grip desperately and spoke again in rapid Tuscan Italian. "Non lasciarmi con quella donna, vuol controller tutto," Elena froze before translating carefully. "She's afraid," Elena said softly. "She believes someone wants to control your company and send her away." Chloe laughed coldly. "This is ridiculous. Adrian, your mother barely remembers what day it is." Viviana immediately shook her head and answered again emotionally in Italian. Elena swallowed hard. She said she remembers enough to know who makes her feel invisible. Silence crashed across the table. Even nearby guests stopped pretending not to watch. Adrian stared at his mother in disbelief. For weeks, doctors had warned him her memory was getting worse. Some days she barely spoke at all. Yet tonight there was clarity in her eyes again, and somehow this waitress had reached her within minutes. Elena gently wiped water from Viviana's sleeve with the white linen handkerchief embroidered with the initials LB, Lei e al Sicuro, Elena whispered softly. "You are safe." Viviana's breathing slowly calmed. Gerard, the restaurant manager, stepped closer immediately. "Elena," he hissed under his breath, "go clean up the mess. Now." Elena nodded politely and started to stand when Viviana suddenly touched her cheek with trembling fingers. "Che bellissima ragazza," the older woman whispered emotionally. "Mi ricordi casa. You remind me of home." The words hit Elena like a knife. For a split second she saw flashes of another life. Antique paintings. Opera music drifting through Romano Gallery in Charleston. Her father restoring damaged canvases before forged debts destroyed everything. Before his stroke forced Elena to leave Florence and abandon her art restoration studies. Before hospital bills buried her family. Before her mother died from heartbreak 6 months later. Elena forced herself back to the present. "I apologize for the accident," she said quietly. Chloe crossed her arms. People like her survive by pretending mistakes are charming. Adrian finally looked toward Chloe, his voice colder than before. "That's enough." Chloe blinked in surprise. Adrian almost never corrected her publicly. Elena lowered her eyes and stepped backward, but Viviana suddenly called after her again. "Aspetta. Wait." The older woman slowly removed the silk scarf from around her shoulders and held it out toward Elena with shaking hands. "Per la ragazza gentile," she whispered. "For the kind girl." Chloe looked furious. Gerard looked horrified. But Adrian said nothing as Elena carefully accepted the scarf with both hands. Because in that moment, beneath the golden lights of Bellucci's, the billionaire realized something he could not explain. His mother trusted this stranger more than anyone else in the room. And for some reason, he already knew this night was about to change all of their lives forever. Elena Romano walked quickly through the narrow service hallway behind Bellucci's, still holding Viviana Rossi's silk scarf carefully in her hands like something too fragile to damage. Her heartbeat had not slowed since leaving table 4. Around her, servers whispered openly while pretending not to stare. In restaurants like this, wealthy people humiliating staff happened every night. But a billionaire's mother publicly clinging to a waitress was something else entirely. What the hell was that? Gerard snapped the second Elena stepped into the kitchen. The manager slammed an order ticket onto the stainless steel counter hard enough to make a dishwasher jump. "Do you understand who those people are?" Elena calmly placed the empty tray down. "Yes." Gerard folded his arms. "Then maybe you should have remembered your place." Elena inhaled slowly, refusing to react emotionally. "I was helping an elderly woman in distress." Gerard laughed bitterly. "No. You were performing." Several cooks nearby pretended not to listen while pans hissed beneath the bright kitchen lights. Elena stayed silent. Silence had protected her dignity long before she ever learned how to defend herself with words. Gerard stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Chloe Belladonna already called the owner. She wants you fired before the night ends." Elena's fingers tightened slightly around the silk scarf, but her expression never changed. "Then fire me." Gerard blinked, almost irritated by her calmness. Most employees begged when threatened. Elena never did. Before he could answer, another voice interrupted nearby. "You should not speak to her that way." Elena turned toward Matteo, Bellucci's elderly pastry chef, flour dusting the sleeves of his white jacket. Matteo had worked there nearly 20 years and rarely defended anyone. He studied Elena quietly before speaking again. The girl handled herself with class. Gerard scoffed. "She dumped water on a billionaire's mother. And then comforted her better than her own family could," Matteo replied calmly. Gerard muttered under his breath and stormed back toward the dining room. The kitchen slowly returned to life, but Matteo continued watching Elena carefully. "Where did you learn that dialect?" he asked softly in Italian. Elena froze briefly before answering in the same language. "My father taught me." Matteo's eyebrows lifted immediately. Very few Americans under 40 spoke Tuscan Italian that fluently anymore. "Your family came from Florence?" he asked. Elena gave a faint smile filled with old pain. "My grandparents did." Before he could ask more, Elena quietly removed her apron and headed toward the employee lockers. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, she opened her worn leather bag and carefully tucked Viviana's silk scarf beside unpaid hospital bills and an old photograph of her parents standing inside Romano Gallery in Charleston 12 years earlier. Elena grabbed her coat and headed toward the employee exit when the front hostess suddenly rushed toward her breathlessly. "Elena," she whispered nervously, "Mr. Rossi's mother refuses to leave the restaurant until she sees you again." Elena Romano stood near the employee exit with one hand gripping her worn leather bag while the hostess waited nervously beside her. "1 minute," she said quietly. By the time she returned to table 4, most of the restaurant had moved on to dessert and cocktails, but the Rossi table remained tense and untouched. Chloe Belladonna sat stiffly with irritation written all over her face while Adrian Rossi stood beside his mother finishing a phone call. The moment Viviana saw Elena approaching again, visible relief softened her expression. "Ah," the older woman whispered warmly in Italian. "La bella ragazza è tornata." The beautiful girl came back. Adrian ended the call immediately and watched Elena more carefully this time. Up close, he noticed details he had missed earlier. Her uniform was simple, but her posture carried quiet elegance. Her voice was calm. Refined. Nothing about her felt careless. Chloe crossed her arms tightly. "This is becoming inappropriate." Viviana ignored her completely and reached for Elena's hand again. "Sit with me for 1 minute," she pleaded softly in Italian. Elena hesitated before carefully sitting beside her. Across the room, Gerard nearly stopped breathing watching a waitress sit at a billionaire's table, but Adrian made no effort to stop it. "What is your name?" Viviana asked gently even though she already knew it. "Elena Romano," Elena answered softly. Viviana repeated the name slowly. "Romano," she murmured thoughtfully. Elena's heartbeat stumbled painfully for a second. Before she could respond, Chloe leaned forward with a smile too sharp to be kind. "She works here, Viviana. That's really all you need to know." Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. Elena noticed it immediately. So did Chloe. Viviana continued speaking softly in Italian while Elena translated parts of the conversation for Adrian. They spoke about Florence, olive trees, tiny villages hidden in the Tuscan hills, and old family recipes nearly forgotten outside Italy. Each answer Elena gave seemed to surprise Adrian more than the last. "You've lived in Italy?" he finally asked. Elena nodded carefully. "I studied there when I was younger." "Studied what?" Adrian asked. Elena hesitated briefly. "Art restoration." Chloe let out a quiet laugh. "And now she carries water trays in Manhattan." Adrian shot Chloe a cold glance. That instantly silenced her. Elena lowered her eyes calmly. "Life changes quickly." Something about the sadness in her voice stayed with him. Most people around Adrian bragged constantly about wealth, travel, and education. Elena spoke about all three like they belonged to another lifetime entirely. Then Viviana gently touched the small silver cross necklace resting near Elena's collarbone. "Your mother gave you this?" she asked softly in Italian. Elena's expression faltered for the first time that night. "No," she whispered. "My father did." Something shifted inside Viviana's eyes then. Recognition. Grief. Warmth. Adrian noticed his mother becoming calmer with every passing minute Elena remained beside her. No panic. No confusion. Just peace. He had spent months hiring specialists from around the world trying to slow her decline, yet somehow this stranger had accomplished more in one dinner than doctors had managed all year. Chloe suddenly pushed back her chair impatiently. "Adrian, we should leave." But Viviana immediately shook her head stubbornly. "No," then she looked directly at Elena with surprising clarity. "Would you come see me again sometime?" The question stunned everyone at the table. Elena blinked in surprise. Chloe looked horrified. Adrian remained completely still before finally speaking in a quiet voice. "My mother doesn't ask for people often," he said. His dark eyes locked onto Elena's fully for the first time that night. "And she hasn't smiled like this in a very long time." A small silence passed between them before Adrian spoke again. Perhaps we could arrange something. Nearly an hour later, Adrian stood alone inside the private elevator of his penthouse while Chloe paced furiously behind him. You embarrassed me tonight, she snapped. Adrian loosened his tie slowly. No. You embarrassed yourself. Chloe froze. Excuse me. Adrian turned toward her for the first time since leaving the restaurant. My mother was terrified tonight. And the only person who treated her with kindness was the woman you humiliated. Chloe let out a bitter laugh. You cannot be serious. Adrian's expression never changed. I've spent 3 years convincing myself. Your cruelty was confidence. Tonight I finally understood the difference. Silence crashed through the elevator. Chloe's face slowly drained of color. You're ending this? Adrian looked exhausted suddenly. It already ended. The elevator doors opened. But Chloe never moved. And for the first time in years, Adrian walked away from her without looking back. Elena Romano barely slept that night. Even hours later, Viviana Rossi's voice still echoed inside her mind while she sat beside her father's hospital bed at St. Vincent Medical Center. The old man slept quietly beneath pale fluorescent lights, his breathing uneven but calmer than before. Elena gently adjusted his blanket before glancing toward the stack of unpaid hospital bills sitting beside her worn purse like silent threats. Around 6 the next evening, her phone vibrated while she prepared for work inside her tiny Queens apartment. Unknown number. Elena answered cautiously. Miss Romano, a calm voice said, this is Anthony Russo from the Rossi residence. Mrs. Rossi would like to invite you to dinner tonight. Elena blinked in confusion. I think there's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Anthony replied politely. Mrs. Rossi specifically requested you. Elena stared quietly at the cracked paint near her apartment window while trying to process the invitation. Wealthy families did not invite waitresses into their homes unless they wanted charity or entertainment. She wanted neither. I can't stay long, she answered carefully. That will be fine. 2 hours later, a black luxury sedan stopped outside her apartment building, drawing curious stares from neighbors sitting near the entrance. Elena nearly cancelled 3 different times before finally stepping inside. 20 minutes later, the car passed through iron gates and climbed a private driveway lined with olive trees wrapped in white lights. The Rossi estate looked less like a Manhattan home and more like an Italian palace transported across the ocean. Marble fountains glowed beneath the night sky while golden windows overlooked the city. Elena instinctively straightened her posture the second she entered the grand foyer. Old habits returned before she could stop them. A housekeeper quietly took her coat while another staff member guided her toward a private dining room overlooking Manhattan. Adrian Rossi stood near the fireplace wearing a dark sweater instead of a business suit for the first time Elena had seen. Somehow he looked even more intimidating without the armor of luxury. The moment Viviana saw Elena enter, her entire face brightened. You came, she whispered happily in Italian. Elena smiled despite herself. Only for a little while. Dinner began awkwardly. Adrian remained mostly silent while Viviana spoke warmly with Elena about Florence, old Italian recipes, and summers spent near Lucca decades earlier. Slowly, something unexpected happened. Viviana laughed. Not politely. Not faintly. Truly laughed. Even the staff serving dinner looked surprised. Adrian noticed every detail. His mother finishing an entire meal without confusion. Her hands no longer trembling. The way she looked toward Elena whenever she forgot an English word. At one point Viviana quietly asked for an old Italian song from her childhood. Elena hesitated before softly singing the opening lines beneath the candlelight. The room fell completely silent. Adrian stared at her differently then. Not like a waitress. Not even like a guest. There was something timeless about the way Elena carried herself inside the estate, as though she belonged among antique paintings and old family history instead of carrying trays in a restaurant. When the song ended, emotion shimmered inside Viviana's eyes. "I haven't heard that song in 40 years, she whispered. Elena lowered her gaze modestly. "My father used to sing it at home." Adrian studied her quietly. "Your father taught you many things." Elena gave a faint smile touched with sadness. "He taught me everything before life forgot us." Silence settled gently over the candlelit table before Viviana suddenly reached across and held Elena's hand tightly. "Promise you'll come back tomorrow," she whispered softly. Elena opened her mouth to politely refuse, but before she could answer, Adrian finally spoke from across the room. "Please." Over the following weeks, dinners at the Rossi estate quietly became part of Elena Romano's life, though nothing about them felt normal. Every evening after finishing her shift at Bellucci's or leaving St. Vincent Medical Center, a black sedan waited outside to bring her uptown. At first Elena insisted she would only stay an hour. Somehow the hours kept stretching longer. Viviana Rossi waited for her every night with the excitement of someone rediscovering pieces of herself she thought were gone forever. Some evenings they translated old Italian poems beside the library fireplace. Other nights they cooked simple Tuscan recipes together in the massive marble kitchen while confused staff members watched a billionaire's mother laugh beside a restaurant waitress covered in flour and olive oil. The changes in Viviana became impossible to ignore. Her panic episodes became less frequent. She smiled more. She slept better. Even her doctors admitted she seemed calmer whenever Elena was nearby. Adrian Rossi noticed something else entirely. The estate no longer felt empty when Elena was there. One night after a brutal 14-hour meeting downtown, Adrian returned home expecting silence. Instead he heard soft laughter drifting from the music room. He stopped outside the doorway without meaning to. Through the half-open door, he saw Elena seated beside Viviana at the grand piano while the older woman struggled through an old Italian melody with trembling fingers. "No, no," Elena teased gently in Italian. "You're rushing the ending again." Viviana laughed like a mischievous child before trying again. Adrian remained motionless longer than he intended. He could not remember the last time his mother sounded that alive. Elena eventually noticed him standing there and straightened slightly. "I didn't realize you were home." Adrian loosened the knot of his tie as he stepped inside. "Neither did the board of directors," he replied dryly. Viviana waved him over immediately. "Sit down, Lorenzo. You work too much." Elena tried not to smile. Apparently even billionaires were still scolded by their mothers. Adrian sat reluctantly beside the piano while Viviana proudly announced, "Elena sings this much better than you ever." Did? Adrian raised an eyebrow. "That's not difficult." Viviana disappeared toward the kitchen insisting she wanted tea, leaving Adrian and Elena alone for the first time without interruption. Silence settled softly between them. Not awkward. Just unfamiliar. Adrian slowly removed his cufflinks. "The doctors say my mother is improving." Elena lowered her eyes modestly. "She simply feels safe. With you." It wasn't a question. Elena hesitated carefully. Sometimes older people become frightened when everyone speaks around them instead of to them. Adrian studied her quietly. "You speak as if you understand loneliness very well." The question landed deeper than he intended. Elena's fingers tightened slightly against the piano bench. "Everyone understands loneliness eventually." Adrian noticed the sadness hidden beneath her calm voice. For weeks he had been trying to understand her. A waitress who spoke like old money. A woman who carried herself with elegance despite exhaustion and simple black uniforms. Nothing about Elena fit together cleanly. "You never ask me for anything," he said quietly. Elena looked genuinely confused. "Should I?" For the first time in days, Adrian almost smiled. Before he could answer, Viviana returned proudly carrying a silver tea tray she insisted on serving herself. Elena immediately stood to help her, and Adrian watched the interaction carefully. The patience. The gentleness. The warmth slowly returning to rooms inside the estate he thought had gone cold forever. Later that night, after Elena finally left, Adrian remained alone in the music room staring at the piano keys she had touched only minutes earlier. Then slowly, almost without realizing it himself, the billionaire smiled. The invitation to the Rossi Foundation Gala arrived 3 days later inside a thick cream envelope embossed with gold lettering so expensive Elena almost laughed when she opened it in the hospital cafeteria beside her untouched coffee. Manhattan's most powerful people would attend. Politicians. Investors. Art collectors. Media executives. The same kind of people who once shook her father's hand before disappearing when Romano Gallery collapsed. Elena immediately decided she would not go. Unfortunately, Viviana Rossi had already decided otherwise. "You promised," the older woman insisted warmly over the phone later that evening. Elena smiled despite herself while adjusting her father's hospital blanket. "That was very manipulative of you." Viviana sounded proud. "I'm an old Italian mother. Manipulation is part of the culture." By Saturday evening, Elena stood frozen inside her apartment staring at the dark emerald gown hanging from her closet door. It had arrived from the Rossi estate earlier that afternoon with no note attached, only matching earrings in a velvet box. Elena nearly returned everything immediately. One evening wearing that dress probably cost more than 3 months of her salary. Yet somehow the gown fit perfectly. Anthony had discreetly asked for her size earlier that afternoon. 20 minutes later, a black sedan carried her toward one of Manhattan's most exclusive hotels where the Rossi Foundation Gala filled a rooftop ballroom overlooking the glowing skyline. Crystal chandeliers reflected against enormous windows while a live orchestra played softly beneath the sound of expensive conversation in champagne glasses. The moment Elena entered beside Adrian and Viviana, heads turned instantly. Not because she demanded attention. Because she carried herself like someone who had once belonged in rooms exactly like this. Chloe Belladonna noticed immediately. Her smile tightened as she crossed the ballroom in a silver designer gown sparkling beneath the lights. "Well," she said sweetly while looking Elena up and down, "this is unexpected." Before Chloe could continue, Viviana proudly looped her arm through Elena's. "Doesn't she look beautiful?" Chloe ignored the question completely. "I didn't realize waitresses attended charity galas now." The insult landed loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Old humiliation rose painfully inside Elena's chest, but before she could answer, Adrian calmly stepped beside her. "Elena is my guest," he said coldly. "And anyone with a problem with that can leave." Silence spread instantly. Chloe still wasn't used to Adrian defending Elena after the breakup. Adrian rarely contradicted her publicly. Around the ballroom, whispers quietly began spreading between guests who recognized tension the second they saw it. Elena tried ignoring the attention while helping Viviana greet donors and collectors, but trouble arrived before dinner was even served. Near the center of the ballroom, an important donor suddenly became agitated while examining a Renaissance painting scheduled for auction later that evening. "This frame is wrong," the collector snapped loudly. "Who authenticated this piece?" Nervous whispers spread between curators and hotel staff while the donor threatened to pull his 7-figure contribution immediately. Chloe rolled her eyes. "It's probably nothing." But Elena's attention sharpened the second she saw the painting. She stepped closer quietly, studying the brushwork beneath the gallery lights before her expression changed completely. "The frame isn't the problem," she said. Several heads turned toward her instantly. Elena stepped closer despite every instinct telling her to stay silent. "The pigments are wrong for the period, and the restoration varnish reflects modern light differently," she explained calmly. "And the signature was added much later." Silence spread across the ballroom. One curator frowned defensively. And how exactly would a waitress know that? Elena hesitated only briefly. Because my father spent 20 years authenticating Italian Renaissance collections. Adrian looked at her sharply. The donor stepped closer toward the painting again, suddenly pale. Minutes later, art specialists confirmed Elena was right. The painting was a forgery worth almost nothing. Shock rippled through the ballroom while reporters immediately began whispering nearby. Chloe stood frozen in disbelief. But Adrian never looked at the painting again. His eyes remained fixed entirely on Elena Romano. The ballroom never fully recovered after the forgery scandal. Champagne still flowed beneath the chandeliers, the orchestra still played softly near the dance floor, and wealthy guests still smiled for cameras, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Elena Romano could feel it in every glance following her across the room. People who had ignored her an hour earlier now whispered behind polite smiles while pretending not to stare. Adrian Rossi noticed it too. For the rest of the evening, he remained close beside her, introducing her personally to investors, donors, and collectors with a calm authority that made it impossible for anyone to dismiss her as just another waitress from Manhattan. Chloe Belladonna hated every second of it. "You embarrassed me tonight," she hissed quietly after cornering Adrian near the ballroom terrace while Elena stepped away briefly with Viviana. Adrian barely reacted. The painting embarrassed itself. Chloe folded her arms sharply. "You're defending her now?" Adrian finally looked at her directly. She protected this foundation from public humiliation. Chloe's expression hardened instantly. No. She made sure everyone noticed her. Adrian said nothing, and somehow his silence felt worse. Across the ballroom, Elena stood beside Viviana near a display of old photographs from the foundation's earliest years. The older woman gently squeezed Elena's hand while studying a black-and-white photo of Adrian as a little boy standing beside his late father in Tuscany. "He used to smile more," Viviana whispered. Elena glanced across the room toward Adrian speaking with investors beneath the golden lights. "He still can," she answered quietly. Before Viviana could reply, an older man suddenly stopped in front of Elena with visible confusion crossing his face. "Excuse me," he said carefully. "Did you say your last name was Romano?" Elena's heartbeat slowed instantly. "Yes." The man stared at her several seconds before disbelief filled his expression. "Giovanni Romano was your father?" Nearby conversations gradually quieted as more guests turned toward them. Elena nodded cautiously. The man exhaled in shock. "My God!" He extended his hand immediately. "Harold Whitmore. Your father authenticated my Renaissance collection 15 years ago." More heads turned now. Another guest nearby recognized the name. Then another. Romano Gallery. One of Charleston's most respected Italian art galleries before its sudden collapse years earlier. Elena felt old memories tightening painfully inside her chest as whispers quietly spread through the ballroom. But now the whispers sounded different. No longer judgmental. Curious. Respectful. Chloe noticed the shift immediately and stepped forward before things moved further beyond her control. "Such a tragic story," she said loudly with fake sympathy. "Their gallery collapsed after several unfortunate financial mistakes." Elena's face went completely still. Adrian noticed instantly. Chloe smiled sweetly toward the surrounding guests. "I suppose some families simply aren't built to survive New York business." Chloe's smile held for exactly 2 seconds. Then she noticed the look on Elena's face. Recognition. Something cold moved through Chloe instantly. Because for the first time that night, she realized Elena Romano might already know what the Belladonna family had done. The insult landed with surgical precision beneath the glamour of polite conversation. Several guests looked uncomfortable. Elena lowered her eyes briefly, but before Chloe could continue, Viviana Rossi suddenly stood straighter than anyone had seen all evening. "Enough," the older woman said firmly. The ballroom quieted almost instantly. Viviana stepped beside Elena and proudly linked their arms together. This young woman has shown more grace, intelligence, and kindness in 1 month than most people show in a lifetime. Chloe looked stunned. Viviana's voice softened slightly as she looked around the ballroom. Some people lose money and become cruel. Some lose everything and still remain noble. Adrian watched Elena carefully then. She looked overwhelmed by the attention, but not hungry for it. Not desperate. If anything, she looked like someone trying not to reopen old wounds. And suddenly Adrian understood something important. Elena Romano had never spent years trying to climb back into high society. She had spent years surviving without it. Later that evening, Adrian found Elena standing alone beside the skyline windows overlooking Manhattan. "You never told me who your family was," he said quietly. Elena kept her eyes on the city lights below. "Would it have changed anything?" Adrian answered honestly. "No." For the first time all night, Elena finally looked at him fully. And beneath the golden lights of the ballroom, something unspoken shifted between them forever. After the gala, Elena Romano's life began changing quietly and all at once. Collectors who had ignored her family name for years suddenly requested meetings. Curators reached out asking for consultations. Art foundations that once pretended Giovanni Romano never existed suddenly spoke about his legacy with admiration. Elena trusted none of it. She had spent too many years surviving to believe sudden respect was genuine. But one thing she could not ignore was how deeply connected she had become to the Rossi family. Especially Adrian. Their conversation stretched longer after dinners at the estate. Some nights they sat beside the library fireplace discussing art, family, and the strange loneliness that came from losing parts of yourself too early in life. Other evenings Adrian simply listened quietly while Elena translated old Italian poetry for Viviana, watching warmth slowly return to rooms that had once felt emotionally frozen. Then one afternoon everything changed again. Elena arrived at St. Vincent Medical Center carrying coffee for her father when she noticed him sitting unusually upright in bed wearing his reading glasses for the first time in weeks. "Papa," she whispered softly in surprise. Giovanni Romano smiled faintly. "You look happier lately." Emotion tightened instantly inside Elena's throat. Before she could answer, Giovanni gestured toward the television mounted in the hospital room corner. A business press conference played quietly in the background. Adrian Rossi stood beneath flashing cameras announcing a new partnership between the Rossi Foundation and independent art restoration programs across New York. Then the screen behind him changed. Elena froze completely. Romano Gallery appeared across the television beautifully restored to its former elegance. Marble floors polished. Golden lights glowing through the windows. The family name restored above the entrance exactly as it once had been. Reporters erupted with questions while Adrian remained calm beneath the cameras. This gallery once represented extraordinary cultural work in this city, he said simply. It deserves to live again. Elena stared at the screen in disbelief while her father slowly removed his glasses with trembling hands. He bought it back, quietly. Weeks ago. Long before Elena ever learned the truth. Giovanni whispered emotionally. Tears burned instantly behind Elena's eyes before she even realized they were forming. Elena slowly opened her purse. Her eyes fell toward the white linen handkerchief she had carried since the night she met Viviana. LB. Then her stomach tightened. The same initials had appeared years ago on the legal contracts that destroyed Romano Gallery. Lawrence Belladonna, Chloe's father. Across town, Chloe Belladonna sat frozen inside her father's office while financial investigators carried boxes through the lobby downstairs. Lawrence Belladonna had spent 20 years burying what happened to the Romano family. Now the truth was beginning to surface. That evening Adrian asked her to meet him at the gallery itself. Elena arrived just after sunset, her heart beat uneven as she stepped inside the restored building for the first time in over a decade. Warm lights illuminated polished marble floors while the familiar scent of canvas, books, and fresh paint lingered softly in the air like memory itself had been waiting for them to return. Adrian stood near the center of the empty gallery with his hands inside his coat pockets, watching her quietly. Elena could barely find her voice. "Why would you do this?" Adrian looked around the room before answering softly. "Because some things should never have been taken from your family." Elena shook her head slowly, overwhelmed. "You can't buy someone's past back." "No," Adrian agreed quietly. "But maybe I can help give them a future." Silence settled gently between them beneath the golden gallery lights while Elena stared at her family's name restored above the archway. For years she had convinced herself that chapter of her life was gone forever. Yet somehow this man had rebuilt pieces of it brick by brick without asking for anything in return. Adrian stepped closer slowly. "The night you spoke to my mother in Italian," he said quietly, "something changed in this house. In me." Elena's breath caught softly. Adrian smiled faintly then, the guarded billionaire finally fading long enough for her to see the man beneath him. "You gave my mother peace again," he whispered. "And somewhere along the way, you stole my heart too. And I'm done pretending I don't want a future with you." Elena laughed through tears before lowering her eyes shyly. "That sounds dangerously close to flirting, Mr. Rossi." "Good," Adrian answered gently. "Because I've been trying very hard to do exactly that." Near the gallery entrance, hidden quietly in the shadows, Viviana Rossi watched them with tears shining proudly in her eyes while whispering softly to herself in Italian. "Finally, this family feels alive again."